There are things you cannot take back. Words, first of all, especially the ones spoken into a microphone in front of 32 people in the ballroom of the Hilton on Broadway in Nashville, Tennessee, on a Friday evening, the 7th of November. I was standing at the drinks table when it happened. A glass of sparkling water in my hand. I don't drink at events I've organized myself because you always need to be watching for whatever might go wrong. 6 hours before that moment, I had been arranging the floral centerpieces on the tables. 4 hours before, briefing the waitstaff. 2 hours before, greeting guests at the entrance and directing each of them to their seats, according to the seating chart I had spent 3 weeks putting together. My father, Donald Harper, 62 years old, 30 years as regional director of a construction company called Mid-South Development, was standing in the center of the room with a glass of whiskey, talking to Richard Cole, the vice president of the company's head office, who had come in specially from Atlanta. This was an important guest. My father was smiling the way he only smiles in the presence of people whose opinion matters to him. Then he turned, saw me, and said, casually, the way you say something completely self-evident, "Ah, Richard, this is Claire. She helps me around the house, cooks, cleans, and helped out a little with the organizing here tonight." Richard Cole gave a polite nod. My father was already turning back. I was standing in a dress I had bought specifically for that evening, wearing a name badge that read Event Coordinator, one I had printed myself. In a room I had designed from the first flower to the last place card on the table. Helps around the house. That is what I am, according to my father. Not a daughter, not a person with a name and a profession, a housekeeper he had graciously invited to help. I set down my glass, looked at the small table nearby where the wireless microphone was sitting, the one I had rented, connected, and tested 3 hours earlier. Then I looked at my father. He was already saying something to Richard Cole, laughing, not looking back. I picked up the microphone. The room didn't go quiet immediately. People were still talking, silverware was still clinking, someone was laughing in the corner. Then someone noticed I was standing there holding a microphone and said quietly to the person beside them, "Looks like there's going to be a toast." My father turned, saw me with the microphone. On his face appeared that condescending smile I have known since childhood, the smile of a man who is certain he is about to hear something brief, appropriate, and convenient. He didn't know that I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. I just hadn't known it myself. Until the second I felt the weight of the microphone in my hand. But before I tell you what I said, I need to explain how I ended up in that room at all. How it came to be that a 30-year-old woman with a college degree and her own career is standing at her father's party in the role of someone invisible, whom he has just introduced to a vice president as the help. This didn't begin that evening. It began much earlier. If you have ever been part of a family where some children are seen and others are not, you know what I mean. Leave a comment. I read every single one. And stay, because what I said into that microphone changed more than just that evening. Let me describe the house I grew up in. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, 2-story colonial style in a suburb of Nashville, Williamson County. A manicured lawn. Dad hired a landscaper, but told guests the family took care of it. A kitchen with granite countertops that had to be wiped completely dry immediately after cooking because watermarks, in my father's view, were evidence of a disordered mind. 4 people lived in that house. Donald Harper, my father. Linda Harper, my mother. Bradley Harper, my older brother, 4 years my senior, and me, Claire Harper. Of the 4 of us, 3 existed in that house. 1 served it. I won't say my parents didn't feed me, or that my father hit me across the face. Everything was subtler than that, and because of that, far harder to explain to people who haven't lived in a similar house. There is no single large fact. There are 1,000 small ones, and each by itself sounds like nothing. But together, they add up to a very clear picture of who you are in your own family's system of coordinates. Here are a few of those facts. Bradley played on the school baseball team. Dad came to every game, sat in the front row, brought a thermos of coffee, filmed everything on a camcorder. After the game, they went to dinner together, just the 2 of them. A men's ritual, as Dad called it. I sang in the school choir for 3 years. In 3 years, my father did not come once. When I asked him why, he said, "Claire, I have work. You understand." I understood. I learned to understand very early. When I was 16 years old, I won first place at the city journalism competition called Young Voice of Tennessee. I wrote a feature story about veterans' families in our county. I conducted interviews, took the bus to another part of town, sat up nights over the text. A jury of 8 people gave me first place unanimously. The editor-in-chief of the city newspaper wrote me a letter of congratulation and offered to publish the story. That evening, I came home with the certificate and the letter in my hands. My father was watching football. My mother was setting the table. I showed the certificate to my mother. She said, "Well done, Claire. Help me with the plates." I showed the certificate to my father. He looked at it for a second, nodded, and said, "Good. Go wash your hands. We're about to eat." The certificate hung in my room afterward. No one saw it but me. My mother, Linda, was a woman who had mastered the skill of not noticing what caused pain, when not noticing it preserved peace in the house. She wasn't cruel. She was convenient, in the way that people become convenient when they have long since decided that their own preferences matter less than quiet at the dinner table. I don't judge her for it. I understand her better than she probably realizes. But it was from her that I learned to do what I did for so many years afterward. Show up when asked. Do what needs doing. Don't say what you think. Call it love. It isn't love. I understood that late. But I did understand it, eventually. When I was 18 years and 3 months old, I applied to the University of Memphis journalism program. On my own, without anyone's help. I found the information about student loans, filled out all the forms, wrote my application essay in the library after school because the house was too loud. Bradley and his friends were watching something in the living room, and Dad didn't want to be disturbed. When I told my father I had been accepted, he said, "Journalism? Claire, you don't have a business mind. That's not a real profession. Why would you spend money on that?" I asked whether he would help with tuition. He said, "No." Just no. No explanation, no "let's discuss it," no "pick something else and we'll talk." Just no. And he went back to his newspaper. Bradley was accepted to Vanderbilt University that same year. Dad paid for all 4 years, in full. He never once mentioned it as a sacrifice or a burden. I took out a student loan for $22,000 and left for Memphis. In college, I worked, waitressing in the evenings, department assistant in the mornings, freelancing for a local online publication on weekends. I didn't complain. There was nothing to complain to anyone about because I had no other option. And complaining when you have no options is simply a waste of time. I finished the degree in 3 years and 8 months instead of 4, with honors. My father did not come to the graduation ceremony. He called that evening, not to congratulate me, to ask whether I could come the following week to help my mother sort through the garage, because they were planning to sell some old furniture and needed someone with a car. I said, "Of course, Dad. I'll be there." And this is the part I cannot explain to people who haven't lived it. Why I kept coming. Why, having graduated with honors, having taken a job as an editor at a small Nashville publication, having built my own life, I still showed up every time he asked. Cleaned the house before his guests arrived, cooked lunches for his colleagues at home events he called business meetings, washed his car before important trips, organized my mother's birthdays, which he always forgot to plan. Why? Because my mother would call and say, "Claire, Dad's asking." And in that "Dad's asking," there was something that tightened something in my chest that I hadn't yet learned to name correctly. Because somewhere very deep down, I was still waiting for the moment when he would turn around and actually see me. Really see me. Say something that would change the tally. Use my name in the right context. It never happened. When his colleagues asked, "Donald, what does your daughter do?" he would answer, "Something with newspapers. Nothing serious." Something with newspapers. By that point, I was running an investigative city column read by 40,000 people a month and had received a regional journalism award for a piece on housing violations in the county. But that was something with newspapers, nothing serious. I kept coming, again and again and again. Until that evening in November. In July, my father announced that he was retiring on the 1st of December and wanted a formal celebration. He wasn't asking. He was informing. There is a difference, one he had never observed. The conversation happened at a family Sunday lunch, at the table I had helped set. Dad put down his fork, looked around at all of us, and said, "I need a proper send-off. Something decent, not embarrassing to invite people from the company. Bradley's busy. He's got a deal in Dallas through November. Your mother can't manage it alone. Claire, you're good at organizing things." It wasn't a request. It was an assignment. My mother looked at me with the expression I know as, "Please don't argue with him right now." I didn't argue. I said, "All right, Dad. Let's talk through the details." The next day, I opened my laptop and started a list. 3.5 months. That is how long the preparation took. The first month, the venue. I visited 7 hotels and event spaces in Nashville, requested quotes, compared prices, read reviews, drew out trial table arrangements on paper. Dad wanted no fewer than 30 people, but no more than 40, because more than that gets unmanageable. I found a room at a hotel on Broadway that seated 35 comfortably and had the right view from the windows. Dad had mentioned he wanted a view of the river. I negotiated with the events manager, agreed on a contract, paid the deposit. Out of my own money, because Dad said, "Invoice me afterward. We'll sort it out." The second month, the menu. Dad sent me a 3-page handwritten list of preferences. Literally 3 pages, with notes like, "The beef should be medium, no more. Last time somewhere it was overdone." And, "Linda doesn't eat seafood, but you can offer it to guests, just not shrimp. Cole might have an allergy. Check." I checked. I contacted Richard Cole's assistant in Atlanta. I put together a menu, went over it with the hotel's head chef, made a vegetarian option for 2 guests Dad added to the list at the last minute. The third month, everything else. flowers. I had 3 meetings with the florist because Dad rejected the first 2 options, too much and too little. Sound equipment. I rented a wireless microphone and a small speaker, checked the room's acoustics in person. Name cards for every guest. A printed event program on heavy ivory-colored stock. A slideshow covering 30 years of Dad's career. I contacted all his colleagues and asked them to send photographs, collected them, edited the whole thing, added music. In all that time, my father never once said thank you. He called with notes. "Claire, I heard that hotel has bad parking. Claire, make sure the tables aren't too close to the speakers. Claire, I added 2 more people last week. Have you updated the list?" I updated. I checked. I addressed every note. The evening before the party, he called and said one thing. "Dress properly. Don't embarrass me in front of people." I put the phone down, sat in the quiet of my apartment for a moment, then took the blue dress out of my closet, the one I had bought 3 weeks earlier specifically for that evening. Not because he had asked, because I had decided. The difference matters. On the 7th of November, I arrived at the hotel at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The event started at 8. 4 hours is not overcaution. 4 hours is exactly what it takes to receive the flowers from the florist, arrange them according to the diagram I had drawn by hand and photographed so I wouldn't mix anything up, check the sound equipment, confirm the slideshow runs correctly from the laptop via HDMI, count the name cards, and discover that the print shop had spelled Richard Cole with 1 L, and rewrite the card by hand with a good marker matching the same font. The waitstaff arrived at 5:30. I briefed them for 20 minutes, the sequence of courses, the protocol for changing silverware, which guests were vegetarian, who couldn't have seafood. The head waiter, a young man of about 25 named Marcus, listened carefully, then said, "Are you an event manager?" I said, "No, just organizing for family." He nodded and added, "You're very good at this." That was the first compliment I received that day. From a waiter, not from my father. The first guests began arriving at 7:45. I met them at the entrance, checked them against the list, walked them to their tables. Some I was seeing for the first time, colleagues from other offices, people Dad knew through industry associations, a couple of neighbors. All of them said the same thing. "How beautiful it is in here." Someone added, "Donald really put in the effort with the organizing." I smiled and said, "I'm glad you like it." Dad and Mom arrived at 8 on the dot. Bradley came in at 8:15 with his wife Ashley, who hugged me and whispered, "Claire, this is absolutely beautiful." I had always loved Ashley. She saw things. At around 8:40, after everyone had been seated and the appetizers had been served, one of Dad's colleagues came over to him. Paul Decker, Deputy Director of Construction. He looked around the room, then looked at Dad and said, "Donald, who organized all of this? This is first-rate work." Dad smiled, spread his hands, said, "It all just came together somehow." I was standing 3 meters away from him. I heard every word. It all just came together. 3.5 months of work, 7 venue visits, negotiations with a florist, a hand-corrected name card, 20 minutes of waitstaff briefing, a slideshow of 114 photographs I had gathered one by one. All of it just came together. I took a glass of water from the table and stepped over to the window with the view of the river. The view I had specifically chosen this room for. Sometime around 9 o'clock, Richard Cole approached my father. A tall man of about 55, in a well-cut suit, with the manner of someone accustomed to his time being valued. They were talking about something. I could see from across the room that Dad was nodding, gesturing, laughing. Then Dad turned, saw me, and did what he did. He beckoned me over with a gesture, the kind you use to summon a waiter, and when I walked over, he said to Richard Cole with the ease of someone saying something entirely self-evident, "Richard, let me introduce you. This is Claire. She helps me around the house, cooks, cleans, and helped out a bit with the organizing tonight." Richard Cole extended his hand. "Nice to meet you." I shook it, smiled, said, "Likewise." Dad was already turning back toward Cole with some next remark. I took one step back, then another, walked to the small table where the microphone was sitting, picked it up, pressed the power button. It clicked softly, but I felt it in my fingers. The room was still noisy. Glasses were still clinking. Someone was still laughing in the corner. Then someone noticed I was standing there holding the microphone and said something quietly to the person beside them. And the silence began to spread across the room, slowly, like rings moving out across still water. Dad turned, saw me, that smile on his face, condescending, ready for something brief and convenient. I raised the microphone to my lips. Stay. Because what comes next is what made everything else worth listening to. The room was almost completely quiet by the time I spoke. Not the held breath quiet of a formal toast, where people set down their glasses and arrange their faces into expressions of attentive respect. Something different. The specific quiet that happens when people sense, without being told, that something real is about to occur. The kind of quiet that a room full of adults falls into when someone picks up a microphone and doesn't immediately smile. I didn't smile. I said, "I'd like to say a few words, if that's all right." My voice through the speakers was steadier than I expected. I had never used a public address system before. I had tested it 3 hours earlier to make sure it worked. I had not tested what it would feel like to speak through it in front of the people who were now looking at me. I looked at my father first. He was standing with his glass of whiskey, 8 feet away, with the expression still on his face. The one that said, "This will be short, this will be fine. She'll say something appropriate and sit down." I said, "Most of you don't know me. My name is Claire Harper. Donald is my father." A few people nodded. Someone near the back said, "Ah," quietly, making a connection. "Earlier this evening," I said, "my father introduced me to one of his colleagues as the person who helps him around the house. That she cooks, cleans, and helped a little with the organizing tonight." I paused. I want to tell you what helping a little with the organizing tonight actually looked like. And then I told them. Not angrily. That is the part I want to be clear about, because I think people who hear a story like this assume there must have been anger, a raised voice, tears, some kind of scene. There was none of that. I spoke the way I write. Precisely, with specific details. The way you present evidence, not the way you vent. I told them about the 7 venues I had visited in July and August. I described the seating chart I had redrawn 4 times because the guest list changed. I mentioned the 3 meetings with the florist and the 2 rejected concepts, and the 3rd option that was standing in this room right now in vases on every table. I told them about the menu, about contacting Mr. Cole's assistant in Atlanta to verify the seafood allergy, about the vegetarian alternative added at the last minute, about the medium rare specification on the beef. I told them about the slideshow. 114 photographs gathered over 6 weeks, edited on my laptop on weekday evenings after work. I held up the name card for Richard Cole, the one I had rewritten by hand because the print shop had made a typo, and I said, "This is the card in front of Mr. Cole's seat." The print shop spelled his name wrong. I fixed it by hand at 4:30 this afternoon. The room was very quiet. I looked at my father. His expression had changed. The smile was gone. What replaced it was something I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not embarrassment exactly, but a kind of exposure. The look of a man who has just realized that the walls he thought were solid have no foundation. I said, "I have been organizing things for this family for as long as I can remember. School events my father didn't attend. Dinner parties where I was the kitchen staff. A graduation ceremony he didn't come to, followed that same evening by a phone call asking me to help with the garage." One more pause. I'm not the housekeeper. I'm the daughter. And I thought at least one person in this room deserved to know the difference. I set the microphone back on the table. The room stayed quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, someone in the second row began to clap. Slowly at first. Then 2 more people. Then most of the room. My father did not clap. My mother had her hand over her mouth. Bradley was staring at the tablecloth. The applause lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then it faded, the way applause in a room full of people who aren't sure what they've just witnessed always fades. Uncertain, trailing off into the sound of people picking up their glasses again and resuming conversations in lower voices than before. Bradley made the first move. He stood up, cleared his throat, and said something about how we were all proud of Dad and how tonight was a celebration, and could we please raise a glass. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who has spent his adult life managing rooms. Bradley was good at managing rooms. He had learned from our father. A few people raised their glasses. The moment passed over into the next moment, the way moments do at parties, absorbed and redistributed into the general flow of the evening. But the evening had changed. I could feel it in the way people moved, in the way conversations started and then shifted, in the way 3 women I had never met came up to me separately over the next hour and said variations of the same thing. One said, "That took courage." Another said, "I've been in that room. Not this one, a different one. You'll know what I mean." The third, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a very direct way of looking at people, simply squeezed my hand and said nothing. She didn't need to. My father spent the rest of the evening doing what my father has always done in uncomfortable situations. He performed normalcy. He laughed louder. He told the story about the Knoxville project in 2009, which I had heard 40 times. He accepted compliments on the evening's organization with a modest smile and said nothing to correct anyone. I watched him from across the room and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. The specific peace that comes when you have said a true thing out loud and the world has not ended. Then, at 10 minutes to 11, Richard Cole stopped me near the coat check. He was holding his jacket over one arm. He looked at me with an expression that was entirely different from the polite nothing he had offered when my father introduced me as the housekeeper. He said, "Miss Harper, I owe you an apology for earlier. I should have asked a follow-up question." I said, "You had no reason to. You were given information, and you accepted it. That's a reasonable thing to do." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I've been looking for someone to fill a director of communications role in our regional office. We've been searching for 8 months. I watched you work this room for 6 hours tonight. Then I heard you speak." He paused. "I'd like to have a conversation, if you're open to it." I looked at him. This was not what I had expected when I picked up the microphone. I had not picked up the microphone in order to get something. I had picked it up because 30 years of being invisible had accumulated to a weight I was no longer willing to carry in silence. But I said, "I'm open to it." He handed me his card. I put it in my clutch, next to my phone and my lipstick, and the folded copy of the evening's program that I had printed on ivory stock. I drove home alone. The Nashville streets were quiet in the way they get after 11 on the cold Friday night. Emptied out, the lights still on, but the movement gone. I drove with the radio off and my hands steady on the wheel, and thought about the weight of a microphone in your hand and what it means to finally say a true thing to the right audience. My father had called me the housekeeper. I had told 32 people who I actually was. Both of those things had happened. I could not undo either of them. I did not want to undo either of them. He called at 8:47 the following morning. I was at my kitchen table with coffee, not doing anything in particular, just sitting, which is something I rarely do and which I had apparently needed without knowing it. The phone buzzed on the table. His name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. He didn't say good morning. He said, "You humiliated me in front of my colleagues." His voice was the voice he used when he was angry, but did not want to appear angry. Controlled, low, with a precision that had always been more intimidating to me as a child than shouting would have been. He had used this voice to tell me the garage needed sorting. He had used this voice to tell me to dress properly. He was using it now to tell me I had done something wrong. I let him finish. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He covered several points. That I had embarrassed him professionally. That what happened at a family event should stay within the family. That I had always had a tendency to dramatize. That the introduction to Richard Cole had been an offhand comment, nothing more, not worth the response I had given it. That my behavior had been selfish and immature. When he finished, there was a silence. I think he expected me to fill it the way I always had, with softening, with explanation, with some form of concession that would allow us both to pretend the conversation had resolved something. I didn't fill it. I said, "Dad, you introduced me to your vice president as the person who helps you around the house, in front of 32 guests, at an event I spent 3.5 months organizing." He said, "It was a passing remark." I said, "It was a passing remark that described the last 30 years. Another silence. Longer this time. I said, "I'm not calling to apologize. I'm not going to apologize. What I said was true, and you know that it was true. And I think part of why you're upset is precisely because it was true, and it was said where people could hear it." He said, "This isn't how you treat your father." I said, "I treated you the way I always have. I organized your retirement party. I did it well. The difference is that this time I also told someone about it." I heard him breathe. Once. Twice. Then he said, "We'll talk about this later." Which is what he said whenever a conversation had not gone the way he intended and he needed time to reposition. I said, "All right." We hung up. I sat with my coffee for another few minutes. It had gone cold. I didn't mind. 20 minutes later, my mother called. Her voice was not the voice I expected. She didn't sound upset or defensive. She sounded tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just put it down. She said, "Claire." I said, "Mom?" A long pause. Then she said, "You said the things I should have said years ago. I'm sorry I didn't." I sat very still. "I know what it cost you," she said. "All those years. I saw it. I just—" She stopped. I told myself it was easier not to make things worse. I don't know anymore if that was true. It was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in as long as I could remember. Maybe in my entire life. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I'm proud of you. I should have said that more." We talked for another half hour, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. When we hung up, I stayed at the table for a long time after, looking at the cold coffee and the morning light coming through the window, and let that conversation settle somewhere it could stay. The meeting with Richard Cole took place 11 days later, on a Tuesday morning, at the Mid-South Development offices on Charlotte Avenue. I want to be precise about something before I describe it. I did not walk into that meeting thinking of it as a consequence of what I had done with the microphone. I did not think of it as a reward or a vindication or the universe evening a score. I thought of it as a job interview, which is what it was, and I prepared for it the way I prepare for everything, thoroughly, specifically, without assuming the outcome. I spent the preceding weekend reviewing every piece of work I had published in the past 4 years. I identified the projects most relevant to corporate communications, not the investigative pieces, but the profiles, the organizational narratives, the features that required me to understand how institutions present themselves and where that presentation breaks down. I built a brief portfolio. I wrote out 3 answers to questions I expected him to ask, and then set them aside, because I don't perform well from a script, and I know that about myself. I wore the same blue dress, not as a statement, because it was a good dress and I liked how I felt in it. Richard Cole was already in the conference room when I arrived. He stood when I came in, which was a small thing and which I noticed. He had a legal pad in front of him with handwritten notes. I could see from across the table that several lines had my name on them. He had done his own preparation. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He described the role: Director of Communications, Southeast Region, overseeing external messaging, press relationships, community engagement, and internal publications across 6 state offices. The position had been open for 8 months because, as he put it, we kept interviewing people who could do the job technically, and none of them could do the other part. I asked what the other part was. He said, understanding what a room needs before it knows it needs it, and being willing to say the true thing when the convenient thing would be easier. He looked at me when he said that last part. I asked about the team, the budget, the reporting structure, the metrics they used to evaluate communications effectiveness. I asked about the 2 initiatives that had generated the most recent press coverage, and what he felt had worked and what hadn't. I asked about the organizational culture in the regional office versus the head office, and whether he saw those as aligned. He answered all of it, directly, without deflecting. At the end of the meeting, he said, "I'd like to offer you the position. I can have the formal letter out by Thursday." I looked at him. I thought about 40,000 readers of a column my father had called "something with newspapers, nothing serious." I thought about a slideshow of 114 photographs assembled on evenings after work. I thought about a wireless microphone on a small table in a hotel ballroom. I said, "I'd like to accept." I called my father that evening, not to announce it triumphantly. That was not the point, and it had never been the point. I called because he was my father, and I was going to be working in the same professional world he had occupied for 30 years, and I thought he should hear it from me rather than from someone else. He was quiet for a moment after I told him. Then he said, "Richard Cole hired you." Not a question. A statement, with something underneath it that I couldn't fully name. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that might become pride once it had time to find its shape. I said, "Yes." He said, "That's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's a significant position." I said, "I know." He said, "You'd be good at it." 5 words. From a man who had spent 30 years not saying 5 words like those to me. They were not an apology. They were not a reckoning or a resolution or a repaired relationship. They were 5 words, said in a quiet voice on a Tuesday evening. They were enough, for now. 6 months later, this is where I am. The new office is on the 14th floor of a building on West End Avenue in Nashville. There is a window behind my desk that faces north, and on clear days I can see the curve of the Cumberland River in the distance. I chose this desk specifically for that window. I have a thing about windows. I have had it for as long as I can remember, and I have stopped pretending I don't. The work is hard and precise, and requires me to be, simultaneously, a strategic thinker, a careful writer, a diplomat, a fact-checker, and, occasionally, the person who tells a room full of executives something they would prefer not to hear. I am good at all of these things. I was good at them before this job. This job simply gave them a correct container. My team is 6 people. 3 of them came from the previous communication structure, and 2 of them came with me. One of them, a 24-year-old named Priya, who had been working as an admin assistant and had a sharper editorial instinct than anyone I have ever met, I promoted within the first 8 weeks. She had been doing the work for 2 years without the title or the salary. I know what that looks like from the inside. I corrected it. My father and I speak on Sunday evenings, most weeks. The conversations are different from what they were. Not repaired. I want to be honest about that, because I don't think repair is the right word for what happens when a thing has never been correctly built in the first place. Different. More careful. More honest in the specific way that honesty becomes possible when one person has stopped pretending and the other person has, slowly and without announcing it, stopped requiring the pretense. He asked me, about 2 months ago, how the new role was going. I told him. He listened. At the end, he said, "You were always the one who paid attention to everything." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of something real. And real acknowledgement from my father was rarer and more durable than apology would have been. My mother and I talk more than we used to. Real conversations, the kind where something is actually exchanged. She told me recently that she had started a watercolor class on Thursday mornings, something she had wanted to do for years and had never allowed herself. She showed me a photograph of what she had painted. It was a garden. It was not technically accomplished, and it was clearly and entirely hers. and she was proud of it, in the uncomplicated way of someone doing something for no reason except that they wanted to. I told her it was beautiful. I meant it. Bradley called once, about 3 months after the party. He said, "I've been thinking about that night." I said, "So have I." He said, "I should have said something over the years about how things were." I said, "Yes, you should have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry I didn't." I said, "I know." We talked for a while longer. We didn't resolve 20 years in a single phone call, but we were honest with each other, perhaps for the first time, and that is a beginning. I want to say something to you before I finish, because I think you're here for a reason. Maybe you've spent years making things work for a person who introduced you to the world as something smaller than you are. Maybe you've organized the parties, covered the gaps, smoothed the edges, shown up when asked, and been thanked in the language of silence or a wave of a hand. Maybe someone in your family has a name for you that has nothing to do with who you actually are. Here is what I know. Picking up the microphone did not fix my father. It did not repair our history or give me back the years of school events where no one sat in the front row, or the graduation ceremony attended by no one except the people I barely knew from my department. It did not undo any of it. What it did was something smaller and more important. It ended the arrangement. The arrangement where I kept showing up and doing the work and accepting the silence, and in exchange received the ongoing possibility that one day he would see me. That possibility had been keeping me in a position for 30 years that I would never have accepted from anyone else. Once I said the true thing out loud, the arrangement could no longer function. Not because I had destroyed something, because I had simply stopped pretending it wasn't there. The job with Richard Cole was not a reward for speaking. Life doesn't work that cleanly. But it was a consequence of someone seeing, clearly and without the distortion of family dynamics, what I was actually capable of. And the reason that was possible was that I had finally stopped letting someone else's description of me be the loudest voice in the room. My name is Claire Harper. I am a director of communications. I organized a retirement party that my father told 32 people just came together. I know what I did. I know what it was worth. And I no longer need him to know it too. Though I notice on Sunday evenings that he is beginning to. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, recognition, anger, the particular exhaustion of being unseen by someone who should have known better, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose husband secretly supported his family abroad for 11 years without telling her, that story is in the description below. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And if someone has been calling you by the wrong name for years, you have permission to correct them. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.